Good morning, Redeeming Grace Fellowship. Good to be with you again. Before I start, I want to thank Mike for setting me up for verses 18 through 20. I'm sure he did a great job, and I hope I can follow well. To give us a perspective, when I leave my driveway and I go up the street, I run into an environment with a group of conditions that are intended to direct my actions. On the road surface is a white line that runs perpendicular to the flow of traffic. At the end of this white line on the right side is a red octagon on top of a pole with the word stop printed on it. There's an appropriate response to those conditions and an inappropriate response. If I do indeed stop where it says to stop, I am afforded a safe condition from which to evaluate my surroundings before I proceed. If I do not stop, the consequences could be horrific and range from being arrested for breaking the law to injuring or killing myself or someone else. The existence of non-negotiable conditions produce either positive or negative outcomes depending on how those conditions are approached. In 2 Corinthians 5:18, Paul summarizes a series of conditions he has already identified in verses 1 through 17 when he begins this verse with all this. Well, all this what? One of those things found in verse 1 is this heavenly dwelling. It's this added clothing from verse 3. It's this life that swallows up our mortality in verse 4. It's this Holy Spirit that is guaranteed to us in verse 5. It's this anticipation of being home with the Lord and away from the groaning and being burdened in verse 8. It's this awareness of the impending judgment in verse 10. It's this motivational fear of the Lord in verse 11. This reconciliation of God that changes the heart rather than just our superficial appearance in verse 12. This love of Christ that directs us from within in verse 14. This transference of our death penalty to Christ also in verse 14. This calling to no longer live for self but for Christ in verse 15. This new condition that radically changes how we view everything in verses 16 and 17, which Mike just went through. All this in verse 18 is from God. He's the one who made it all possible through Christ. Christ's life, death, and resurrection made every one of these things possible. Without Christ, we would be aware of none of it, much less experience or enjoy or benefit from it. Through his taking our death penalty upon himself, he changed our status from that of being God's enemies and targets of wrath to that of his adopted and beloved children. As he reconciled us to God, he removed what was making us warring parties, but he also induced what has made us allies. And as a result, he has made us reconciled or right with God, no longer wrong. He also gave us the noble calling then to go out and do the same thing as his redeemed. Our job now is to play our part in making others right with God. In verse 19, Paul summarizes the implications of all the listed conditions, where he says that God was making the world right with himself. He was reconciling it. Now, let's clarify some things. First of all, this term world does not mean all people of all time. It does mean the representatives from every tribe and every nation that were made right. This is a correction for those who thought only Jewish people could be right with God. It also means people, as indicated by the following phrase of not counting their trespasses, rather than it meaning nature or the earth, as some have suggested. Not counting those trespasses removes that which makes us enemies of God and targets of his wrath. We are then entrusted with a message that by its nature of being a message is designed to be disseminated. If it were not designed to be disseminated, the text would not say entrusted with a message, it would say entrusted with a secret. Now, since it is a message and not a secret, since this message contains information necessary to change someone from being an enemy of God to a beloved child of God, since we who have been changed are charged with disseminating this message, since all these things are true, since they have come from God and not from man, Since these conditions are non-negotiable, absolute, and highly consequential, and since there is one correct response by all his people, without exception, regardless of talent, gift, or temperament, we are therefore ambassadors. An ambassador seeks to establish and maintain peace between two warring nations. We who have been made right, therefore, have the privilege and the responsibility of going between two warring nations, in this case, God and man. And our job there is to negotiate peace. We make this appeal for reconciliation with those who are at war with God, not for our sake, though, but because God himself is making that appeal through us. We don't do this because we gain from it or like it or enjoy it. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. We do it because the one who made us right is appealing to his enemies, and the mouthpiece he chooses to use is the one who is reconciled already. We, the reconciled, then implore or beseech with pleading, with logic, with rhetoric, with reason, with passion. We, the reconciled, implore you on Christ's behalf, according to Christ's desire, be made right with God. For the completion of our text now, I'd like to hand this time over to our pastor, Caleb Bunch.